Borderline personality disorder is a mental health disorder that has 9 criteria. To be diagnosed with it, you must have 5 of the criteria. They're very loose criteria, and the trauma not PD hashtag disagrees. We believe these criteria and this diagnosis invalidates the effects of trauma. 80% of people who have this diagnosis have a history of trauma. Before we continue, I must give a trigger warning that discussions of sexual abuse and suicide may be raised in today's performance. So if you're not comfortable, please feel free to turn off, or practice self-care. At the end of this show, I'll post up links so you can get some support should you need it. This plate represents my life. I was born a whole, but I didn't realise how fragile I was. I didn't realise that my earliest childhood memory would suddenly come along and shatter my life into pieces. I would then spend many years trying to repair my life, not knowing what was wrong with it. Pieces didn't fit. Pieces wouldn't go back together again. But then I slowly built myself up to be who I was. I didn't realise that I would become one of the 8 in 10 people whose childhood trauma would ruin the rest of their life. Every time I tried to put my life back together again, the gluing the cracks over, but it just wouldn't go back in one. It all just seemed that it wasn't meant to fit. But slowly, I built myself back together again. But there were cracks. Eventually, as I grew older and started to remember what had happened to me as a child, my mental health deteriorated. I didn't like who I was. I didn't fit in with the world. I felt suicidal until one day I broke again. I worked hard with a mental health team, having for many years, to put myself back together again. Thinking I was just depressed. I mean, after all, that's what my GP said. He said I just had clinical depression. But things weren't right. The mental health team put me back together again, and I back in pieces, but I was together as one. Eventually, I received a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. Unlike many people who don't actually receive the diagnosis, I thought I was lucky that I actually understood what was going on. But my consultant psychiatrist said that it was a problem diagnosis. It would cause problems further down the line. I wouldn't be taken seriously. I laughed. I mean, I was back together again. I had a diagnosis. I knew how to look after myself. I knew how to put myself back together again. I went to university. I got a degree. During that time, my trauma came back to affect me. And I had to go to the police to make a statement about what had happened to me. And everything suddenly went. I was broken yet again. I tried to approach the local mental health team. They didn't want to know I wasn't in crisis, so they had nothing to help me. Eventually I did hit crisis level, and they just looked at me and they said, well, you're just emotionally unstable. Well, of course I'm emotionally unstable. I didn't want to live. I was having flashbacks, I was having night terrors. All I could think about was what had happened to me. All of those coping strategies I built over the years to avoid what had hurt me and broken me was now tearing me apart and had disappeared. But I was emotionally unstable. Several more visits to the crisis team resulted in complete shattering. The mental health teams didn't want to know what the cause of my problems were. They just said they couldn't help. I just needed to learn to regulate my emotions. I was screaming out for help to deal with the trauma. I knew that my problems were coming from what had happened to me as a child. Why couldn't they see this? My soul was broken. My body was broken. I was broken. I was a plate. Eventually I was accessed to trauma therapy. I was one of the lucky few. And since then, although I still suffer occasionally from mental health relapses, the bulk of my problems have dissipated. And this is why we urge people, we urge services to look at the trauma, deal with the trauma, because it's trauma, it's not personality disorder. Somebody who's been traumatized as a child, they haven't grown up with a disordered personality. They've grown up living with trauma. So services, if you're out there and you're listening, listen to the people that you're not listening to. They're the ones who know. They're the ones who need your help. Stop breaking people like plates. Because, after all, we're all fragile, and nobody wants to be left shattered.